for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. On today's episode, we have an interview to help us learn more about the Board of Estimates and Taxation, the arm of our local government that sets the maximum property tax level for each year and deals with the city of Minneapolis's ability to take on debt and to issue bonds. It's kind of like the financial section of the local government. I'm interested in the Board of Estimates and Taxation for its potential to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor and how we might use it as a tool to improve the quality of life for the exploited classes in Minneapolis. Before we get into this interview, I wanted to share some of the reflections I was having about taxation and redistribution that I think could be useful going into this interview. First, I want to say that simply taxing the rich is an inadequate solution to our current situation. We need to go far beyond taxing the rich to restructuring the foundations of our political economy that make them rich and that make others poor. That means we need to nationalize industries. We need to collectivize ownership. We need to redistribute land. We need to abolish medical, consumer, and student debt, as well as tax debt held by the poor and working classes. We need to participate in a global proletarian restructuring of the economy that stops the plunder of the global South. We need to deconstruct the prison economy, let thousands and thousands of people out of jail and give them restitution, pay people for damages and missed time and return seized property. Beyond taxing the rich, we need to expropriate from the rich and commandeer from the rich. Simply taxing the rich is not going to cut it, and we cannot allow that slogan to become a palliative, preventing us from getting real about the revolutionary changes that we need to rid us of capitalism. So yes, I want to learn how we can use the Board of Estimates and Taxation to its maximum potential, but I do not want us to think inside of the boundaries of the Board of Estimates and Taxation when setting a redistributive agenda. The current structures of government, like the Board of Estimates and Taxation, are going to be inadequate for bringing democracy and justice and collective wealth to those of us who are currently exploited by capitalism. We have to push them to their limit while building the institutions that will replace them. Another reflection I had while preparing for this interview was on the importance of recognizing and honoring the direct taxation enacted from the bottom up in the form of looting and occupation that we experienced in Minneapolis in 2020. The looting of the George Floyd Rebellion was a direct form of wealth redistribution. It was a strike against the violent, top-down, exclusive property relationships of capitalism. And it was an immediate boom of groceries and medicine and furniture and cleaning supplies and clothes and shoes and other necessities of life by those who are forced to live in poverty and precarity by the status quo. A serious working class movement must recognize this direct taxation as the powerful and organized action that it is and give it at least as much weight as attempts to tax the rich using the state. We detailed the authoritarian and oppressive actions of the Target Corporation on episode 63 of our podcast with Mirjan Sardar. Mirjan walked us through Target's massive investment into law enforcement and surveillance, their aggressive collaboration with the FBI and MPD. They created a no-go zone for Black youth in downtown, and they worked to dramatically increase Hennepin County prosecutions of Black and brown youth. That's not to mention the anti-worker, exploitative structure of Target's global business. The looting of 2020 didn't scratch the surface of the public debt owed by Target, but it was much more than the city or state government has done to rein them in. So salute to all the looters, the People's Board of Estimates and Taxation. Another attempt at redistribution that should be celebrated was the occupation of the Sheraton Hotel. We commandeered the Sheraton and turned that property into an emergency shelter for houseless neighbors during the curfew nights of the George Floyd Rebellion, and it lasted for several weeks after. The liberal DFL government proved unwilling and unable to use their power to convert hotels and empty buildings into housing at anywhere near a scale needed during the pandemic. So organized people directly seized the Sheraton and provided immediate social use for people in need. The occupation didn't last long, and it was not without many problems and challenges, but it should be a moral and political precedent. It's a crime to allow units to remain empty while people sleep outside, and it is our right as human beings to expropriate those buildings for social use. Another example of redistribution I was thinking about preparing for this interview just happened in Berlin, Germany. The people of Berlin just voted overwhelmingly on a referendum to expropriate 240,000 apartments. That's 11% of the total housing stock in Berlin, owned by corporate landlords, and turn it into public housing. This is the type of redistributive measure we can organize for. We cannot just ask politicians to tax the rich. We have to build a movement that can enforce its will through direct action and popular referendum. All right, with that context set, let's learn a little bit about the Board of Estimates and Taxation in Minneapolis, its role, its potentials, and its limitations. I talked with Josh Martin, who I got connected to through Twitter. He's a professional parliamentarian, and he's been researching the local government structures, and he was generous enough to come on the show and help us orient to the Board of Estimates and Taxation. So thank you, Josh. I'll say I left this interview fired up about the potential to use municipal bonds to build public housing, and I left this interview with a lot more questions, which is always really good to have. So with no further ado, I bring to you the interview. Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. We got a special bonus episode today. We're continuing our coverage of the 2021 municipal elections in the city of Minneapolis. We've talked a little bit about candidates. We've talked a little bit about policy. Today, we're going to talk about the structure of the government. And folks might be aware that there's 2 elected positions onto a thing called the Board of Estimates and Taxation. So we're electing the mayor, we're electing the city council, we're electing the park board, and we're electing representatives to this body called the Board of Estimates and Taxation. So I want to learn more about the Board of Estimates and Taxation. It's something I know a little bit about, but I think the average working class person in the cities is not necessarily plugged into or aware of. So really thankful to have Josh Martin joining us today, who was willing to come on the show, who's been doing some of this research and asking some of these questions himself. So thanks for coming on, Josh. And could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm Josh Martin. My day job doesn't have too much to do with politics. In my spare time, I'm also a professional parliamentarian. So I work with a lot of different organizations on rules and things like that. I use that to do a lot of research into the Charter Commission and charter amendments and those processes, and tried to share that with folks.
That's really great. I've never heard the term professional parliamentarian before. That's awesome. Cool. Well, we're here today to talk about the Board of Estimates and Taxation. So could you give us a basic overview? What is the Board of Estimates and Taxation? Kind of who is on it, and what function does the BET serve in the local political economy?
Yeah, so at a very basic level, the Board of Estimate and Taxation is a very specific board which is given authority over like property taxes and bonding / borrowing issues. And there's a few other minor duties that are assigned to them, but those are the two big ones. As to who serves on the Board of Estimate and Taxation, there is a total of 6 members. One is the mayor, which is currently Jacob Frey. Another is the council president, which is currently Lisa Bender. And then there's also another council member. Currently, that's Steve Fletcher in Ward 3. There's also a representative of the Park Board, which is elected by the Park Board and represents their interests. That's currently Londell French. And then finally, there are 2 members elected by the city on an at-large basis. Currently, that's Carol Becker and David Wheeler. And they are both not seeking re-election to that office. So there will be 2 new elected members on the BET.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. So you talked about these 3 areas, property taxes, bonding, and borrowing. So can you talk a little bit more about those, and how does the kind of BET serve out that function? Are they meeting continuously and passing policy throughout the year? Are they focused just on the budget? Like, how do they end up executing those responsibilities?
Yeah, so they have meetings somewhat throughout the year, but they heat up when things get around some of their bigger items. The biggest primary function of the Board of Estimate and Taxation is to set what's called the maximum property tax levy for funding the city government. So that's used to fund the city's budget. The BET doesn't determine the budget itself. That's determined by the city council. So the BET, and the Park Board for their portion of the budget. But the BET determines the maximum amount that can be raised through property taxes.
Okay.
The council doesn't need to set its budget at that maximum amount, but it can't exceed that.
Okay.
And then where exactly all the money within that amount goes, that's up to the city council, the mayor, the Park Board to make those determinations. As for borrowing and bonding, those are 2 related terms. So essentially what bonding is it's government borrowing. So the government accomplishes that through selling bonds. That's essentially a form of debt, promises to repay those money at a specified time and interest rate. If you've ever heard of like treasury bonds that the federal government sells, that's the same concept. The state government also does this quite a bit. The state government, they tend to alternate between like budget years where they set the budget, and then bonding years where they do a lot of capital bonding projects. And generally bonding projects are used to fund large capital projects. So buildings, roads, sometimes maintenance on existing buildings and roads.
Yeah.
And they're often things that, because buildings are very expensive, you want to be able to fund those over a period of years rather than having to pay for it all at once.
Right. I really appreciate that. It's come up a couple times on our show. We started this podcast as a critique of the Upper Harbor Terminal redevelopment in North Minneapolis. And that project received some state bonding money to build some infrastructure. And what they're building with that bonding money is a performance venue. And then we talk a lot about public housing and housing justice on this show. So I'm really interested in the power of bonding to build public housing. That's like an idea I see advocated across the country, and it sometimes comes up here, but I want to be able to talk about with more clarity and specificity, So even like hearing you break it down that way is, what type of projects do you know have been bonded for by this Board of Estimates and Taxation? Would you know that? Like,
I do not know that off the top of my head. No, sorry about that.
No, it's all good. It just came to me now. That's a good thing for us all to research, I guess, to know like if they had some bonding power, what type of things were being built. I know, like, for example, when I hear people advocating for building public housing using bonds, they say we could do it with the same bonding process we use to build like public libraries or other public buildings, and thinking of bonding as a way to generate capital for the public sector, I guess, is a good thing for us to recognize as a potential. I wanted to ask.
I see no reason why it couldn't be used in that way.
Awesome. Hell yeah. If the parliamentarian says it, we can do it. I wanted to go back to that property tax. So that's the bonding portion. That first responsibility is setting the maximum property tax amount, percentage that a property can be taxed. Can you talk to us about how properties are taxed in Minneapolis? Does every property get taxed the same? Does a commercial property get taxed the same as a residential property? Or does, like, say, a downtown skyscraper get taxed the same as a single family home?
So yeah, that gets pretty complicated. My understanding is that commercial and residential properties are not taxed the same. There are different taxation rates. There is also, I believe, some variation even within that for classifications. Like I think rental properties are actually taxed at a higher rate than single family homes. And there are
Okay.
some arguments for and against that.
Yeah.
On the one hand, single family homes may have more income. That may or may not be the case. But also in a rental property, especially if it's a large rental property, you're spreading that cost out over more people. And then I also know, even within that, two single family homes are not necessarily taxed the same, because those two
Right.
single family homes are worth varying amounts.
Right.
So there's variation on that level too. So the way that funds are raised and the property tax is set maybe a little bit backwards from how most people might think about it. I think what a lot of people imagine is that they set the rate. So how, like, a lot of membership organizations, for instance, might work. For instance, they set the amount of their dues, and maybe they set the amount of their membership dues at $50, right? And then you add all that up, and then you get how much money the organization has.
Right.
The way the levy process works is kind of backwards of that. So instead, they figure out what is the maximum property tax levy, what is the maximum amount of money we are going to raise from across the city and all of the taxable property in the city. And then from there, then they start figuring out, okay, how much of that does each individual property have to pay based on how much that property is worth and what the taxation rate is for that property. So that, because of that, that can make things complicated when people talk about, like, let's say there's a 5% tax increase in a particular year. That doesn't necessarily mean that individual properties are going to see a 5% tax increase, because it depends not only on the increase in the tax, but also how much the value of that property has changed, and also how much the value of all the other properties in the city have changed, either because they have become more or less valuable, or because new properties have been built in the city. Then those are also included in the tax base.
Okay, I see. So if you hear it's like a 5.8% maximum tax levy, that's like the general number. And then it's broken down, and each property is going to feel that differently based off of, like, how they're valued.
Correct.
And that's interesting. I wanted to say, like, it's come up during the Upper Harbor Terminal organizing, and it's come up in other times in this show, a lot of working class people raising concern about increase in property tax value, right? Say you have someone who's paying their mortgage with their social security check, or on a fixed income or a tight working class income, and their neighborhood's being gentrified and their property taxes are skyrocketing. That's a displacement pressure. We hear a lot about increasing rents for renters being displacement pressure, but increasing property taxes for working class homeowners is also a displacement pressure. So I just want to name that, and name the ways that white supremacy is so baked into the way properties are valued in the United States. There's a lot of literature out there, and I'm sure people who know more than me, but I know through understanding restricted racial covenants, and then understanding the ways that properties are taxed. It's not a neutral science. It's about the political economy, and white supremacy is all baked into that. And I'm not necessarily asking you to respond to that, but just naming that for our listeners. And if you do have a response, that's why sometimes I feel a tension. I want to learn about the Board of Estimates and Taxation, and then not accept the Board of Estimates and Taxation as, like, the form that we have to accept, Does that make sense?
And that does make sense. I think what I would say to that in terms of the Board of Estimate and Taxation's role is that the Board of Estimate and Taxation doesn't have the authority to determine the rates at which different properties are taxed, a lot of that's actually determined in state statute, is the
Okay.
types and rates that different properties are taxed, and the
Okay.
standards that are used for assessing properties.
Thank
And
you.
then the actual assessments are completed by the city assessor's office.
Yep.
So the BET can't decide on its own that we should tax rental properties more or less, or anything like that. That would
Right.
need to come at the state level. So all they can really do is really just decide on the maximum levy amount, and then decide on bonding projects.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really clarifying. And that reminds me, like, I've heard someone from the city's assessor's office actually came out and addressed in the Upper Harbor Terminal meeting. So it'd be interesting to learn more about the city assessor's office also, and where they fit into this. How would you say, like, you know, who is the Board of Estimates and Taxations accountable to, and how does the public influence the Board of Estimates and Taxation?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, the Board of Estimate and Taxation is accountable to the people of Minneapolis. 3 of their members are elected directly by the people of the city. That would be the 2 at-large members, and the mayor, of course, are all elected. I don't know that people necessarily think of the mayor's role in the BET when they're electing the mayor, but they do elect the mayor. And the other people are elected too. They do elect the council members, and they elect all of the other council members. And same thing with the park board. So they kind of indirectly elect the other members of the BET, because they're elected by bodies whose members are elected by the people of Minneapolis. There is also some aspect in which the members who are members of the city council are accountable to the council, and similar that the park board member is somewhat accountable to the park board. I know that's one reason historically why the park board has argued for maintaining the BET. In most cities, the city council just does this. There is no BET, that doesn't exist.
Interesting.
But because we also have an independent park board, if the city council were to set these amounts, then the park board would have no role in setting the maximum levy for the park board's portion of the budget. So that, I think that's one concern that the park board has in making sure they can maintain their independence.
Interesting. Is that something that people have tried to move in the past, is like eliminate the Board of Estimates and Taxation? You know, kind of like this year we have a lot of
Mhm.
changes to the charter potential on the ballot. People have made that type of move in the past.
Yeah, there actually was a proposal to eliminate the Board of Estimate and Taxation as recently as 2009, which did end up going on the ballot and was defeated.
Oh, wow.
There was another proposal to was submitted to the Charter Commission this year, I want to say, again, to eliminate the Board of Estimate and Taxation. And a lot of the members of the Charter Commission were also there when the last one came up. And so remembering that, they did not have a lot of interest in taking that up again. And I believe in both cases, I think the specifics might have differed, but in both cases, it assigned the duties which are currently performed by the BET to the city council.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for that. I have another question. I was looking at the Board of Estimates and Taxation section on the city website,
Mhm.
and it says what you just taught us. The BET holds public hearings to consider input from residents on the maximum tax levies for certain tax funds in the city. The board sets the maximum tax levies for the following funds. And then it has like the general fund, the permanent improvement fund, the police personnel expansion fund, the Minneapolis Retirement Association levy, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority levy. Those are all city council, and there's more of them. And then it lists which funds for the park board, and then other funds. Is that saying that does the Board of Estimates and Taxation divvy out the amounts specific for each of those funds, or those hearings are just to decide the maximum tax levy, and then the city council decides which of the funds it goes to? Am I asking that clearly?
You are asking that clearly. So they do set the amounts for each of these funds. Some of these funds haven't necessarily actually been used in a long time. The police personnel expansion fund, I think that might be, there's a section of the city charter that talks about how there can be additional taxation to fund the police department. I don't think we actually use that. I think they mostly just fund them out of the general fund.
Okay.
Similarly, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority levy, that's not currently used. I understand that it may have been used in the past.
Wow.
So not all of these funds actually have any money in them. But yes, the BET does set the amounts for each of these funds. On here, by far the two big ones are the general fund and then the Park and Recreation Fund, which is kind of the Parks and Rec equivalent of the general fund.
Right.
And both of those kind of fund most of the stuff in the city. The city council can use the general fund for pretty much whatever. The Park and Recreation Fund can be used for pretty much whatever. And then breaking it down further than that, like what are the different things in the general fund used for? That's up to the city council to decide, not the BET. But the BET can put money in these other funds, and those are assigned for some more specific purposes.
Wow, thank you so much for that. That was so clarifying. So when we're going and we're debating every year around the city council budget, trying to get them to pull money away from police or put money into something else, we're generally arguing over the general fund. That's the money that is being decided how it's allocated. There's a whole, yes. And
primarily,
then
yes. Yep.
Okay. And then I think the one that you mentioned is really important. The one that catches my eye most on this is the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority levy. That means that the Board of Estimates and Taxation is empowered to set a maximum amount and dedicate public money, tax money, to the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority levy. That's hugely important. That's a really important tool that we need to utilize and we need to understand more about. That's very helpful for me. And that kind of leads into my other question that's kind of general, is like, what creative potential is there for like progressive taxation, would you say, on the Board of Estimates and Taxation? Like I'm interested in taxing the wealthy for the social good, you know? Do you see any creative potential in there, or have you thought about that at all?
So my understanding, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Board of Estimate and Taxation does not have the authority to change the way in which property taxes work. Like that's established at the state level.
So it's not like they could
can
say
decide
the Polad's got to pay this much more taxes. Like if you own a skyscraper downtown, we're going to tax you at an extra rate. They don't have the authority to do something like that.
I mean, the skyscraper downtown, I think there might already be some distinctions for commercial property in state law and things like that. And certainly, if a house is worth more, that the percentage of that value is going to mean that they're going to pay more. But no, the BET doesn't have the authority to change the scheme under which property tax is assigned.
Got it. But they could do something like pump money into that public housing fund, or use those funds creatively to like move money with a direction.
To an extent, I mean, there are only so many of these specialized funds.
Right.
But yeah, to the extent that those funds are available, they could dedicate money to those specialized funds. Yep.
Thank you. I see another, back to the debt management responsibilities of the Board of Estimates and Taxation. One thing I've always wanted to learn more about is the way that cities get like credit reports and credit ratings. And I seen on here that part of the Board of Estimates and Taxation's responsibility is responding to rating agency questions. Do you have any knowledge or thoughts around that, like that debt management operation of the city?
I have no knowledge of that. No,
it's so arcane. I've it's just one of these things where you like start peeling away the onion, and I'm like, whoa, like, yeah. But the fact that cities get credit reportings, credit ratings, that has something to do with the Board of Estimates and Taxation. So I'm like ticking that as like a further research area. Do you have any other thoughts, like in your research with the Board of Estimates and Taxation, that you think it'd be important for people to know? I think this was already like really a super helpful rundown. I know I've learned a lot, but is there anything else you think is interesting about it, or you think people should know?
Nothing comes to mind.
Nice. Nice. Well, I think we can leave it there. We just got a really nice overview crash course on the Board of Estimates and Taxation from Josh Martin. Thanks so much for coming on and joining us. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land.